Hello, everyone. Today's blooper is a sign in an outdoor food market in China um, on a stall that meant to say in English, fresh herbs. And instead, this sign on the outdoor food stall in China said that it was selling fresh herpes. Very appetizing, of course, and delightful to have that. Today's guest is Michael Markiewicz. He's the founder and owner of Markiewicz Enterprises, LLC, a New York-based financial services company specializing in CPA services, consulting services, and asset protection. Many of his clients are foreigners coming to the US to open businesses. He has over 40 years experience also providing financial guidance to entertainment professionals, family offices, and small businesses, and C-level executives. Outside of his practice, Michael is a successful investor, speaker, and is very involved with many philanthropic endeavors, one of which I will ask him about. So welcome, Michael. Delighted that you're with us today.
Thank you, Philip. It's great to be here. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. So perhaps you could start by just telling us a bit about not so much your CPA background, but how you developed a background with so many international clients. It's unusual because most CPAs are very US focused and you are more internationally focused.
Sure. So it almost happened by accident. I have a very good friend who is Brazilian living in Rio de Janeiro, and he is involved in a worldwide, global kind of consortium of language translation people. And they had asked him, about setting up an entity in the United States to do business here.
Sorry, they asked whom?
Asked me.
Oh, you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And, I told him, well, sure, I think I can help you. I don't think this is going to be that crazy busy or impossible for me to do. And so as a result of that, and they did become my client, I helped them establish an entity here in the United States and subsequently took care for them of all of their financial and tax filings that were required. Mm-hmm. And this person referred me to that person, referred me to that person, and so on and so forth. And, in the kind of business and practice that I have, a lot of my business comes through those kinds of referrals, whether it be for international or not.
Yeah, that's great. And so it just grew from there, from those referrals.
It did indeed.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, our language translation agency started similarly over 30 years ago. We were approached out of the blue one day by a group of translators in, of all places, New Zealand. And they were looking for a marketing agent, and that fit with my background of international marketing and language study and language knowledge and so forth. And so we just started with them, and they were our translation group for about 6 years, and they no longer are. But by then we were well established.
Well, similar to you, that initial company that was my first international client, is also no longer my client. but it's not because of anything that I didn't do. It's just because they decided to move out of the US market.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and in our case, the quality diminished to a certain extent, and we couldn't have that, so we got a different model.
Right.
Fascinating. So I understand that. Let's skip ahead for a moment while I'm still thinking of it. I know that you've got a wonderful nonprofit in Malawi. Perhaps you could tell us about that and how you came into that and what you do for them and so forth.
Okay, sure. So it started because I have a client who actually works for TED. And I think everybody these days knows what TED is. And back in 2007, TED held an international conference, one of their big international conferences in Africa, in Tanzania. And one of the people that was there for the conference from the United States discovered this young man from Malawi by the name of William Kamkwamba. And William was 14 years old. And, Malawi is an extremely poor country, like many countries in that region. but it's a very, very poor country, and his father could not afford the $80 a year in tuition for him to continue to go to school. So through his own ingenuity, he took some books out from the local library on physics, and they had no electricity in his home or in that town, and he ended up building a windmill out of scrap materials that he found in the local junkyard.
Huh.
And that windmill, and everybody thought he was crazy. Everybody in his village thought he was crazy, because here he is building this windmill. He built this windmill, and the first windmill he built generated enough electricity to power a single light bulb and a radio in his family's home.
Wow.
And then he built a second windmill to pump water from underground to irrigate his father's crops, because they have a tremendous long periods of time in Malawi of drought, and he would lose a lot of his crops. And because of this, he was no longer losing his crops. Anyway, fast forward, they brought William to the TED conference to speak about what he had done. And my client, of course, who works for TED, was there. Apparently, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And if you actually go on the TED website, you can see William Kamkwamba's speech in Tanzania.
Wow.
And it's a TED talk. And came back home to New York, and he approached me, and he said, he met with me, and he said, Michael, I want to start a not-for-profit, and I want it to be an organization that works with people on the ground in Malawi to provide education, that is much more available to all, right. and to work on sustainable economic development. So so we did start that. He asked me to be the CFO, treasurer, and I agreed. And subsequent to that, that organization is still running very strong, and stronger than ever, in fact, now. And so that was a US-based not-for-profit. We now have also established a not-for-profit in Malawi. And just as an aside, there's actually a book that was written both by William and an American co-writer called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. Wow. And there's actually a Netflix film based on this with Idris Elba in the film. That's so if you can catch either the book or the film or both, I highly recommend them.
That's fascinating. I think for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, we should clarify that in Africa and in many developing countries for that matter, public education technically is free, but parents have to pay what are called school fees, which are basically for books, for the mandatory uniforms, and for school supplies and so forth. So if a family is poor, obviously it doesn't have the school fees, and the kids can't afford to go to school.
Precisely.
So
thank you for that.
So yeah, and when I lived in Africa, I encountered the same thing, and I paid school fees for some of the young people I met as well.
Okay.
So just on the subject of Malawi, are there cultural differences or business issues that you found just dealing with them?
Yeah, there are definitely cultural differences, as anyone might imagine, between U.S. culture, and we have many different cultures as well, but overall U.S. culture versus culture in a developing country in East Africa like Malawi. The good news is that William is now, he lives in the United States now. He went to the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg to learn English, and he came to the United States. He went to Dartmouth College and got his bachelor's degree in engineering.
Wow.
And he met his current wife there. They're married, living in North Carolina, and have a child.
That's fantastic.
So here's the thing: is that William and his wife Olivia, they travel to Malawi frequently.
Right.
She's not from Malawi; she's from the United States, but they travel to Malawi frequently to work on, the organization that exists there. And we still handle all of the finances for both the U.S. and the Malawian entities. Right. But we don't file any tax returns in Malawi, but we do, because the Malawian entity is a subsidiary of the U.S. not-for-profit, we have to incorporate that into the U.S. But in terms of what's happening on the ground there, I'm personally not directly involved in that. So the cultural differences that exist are very much handled by William and his wife Olivia.
Okay.
You know, and
That makes
because
sense.
he's from there, she's from here, and they bridge that cultural gap.
Huh, fascinating.
Yeah,
And what is the name of the organization?
it's called Moving Windmills Project.
Moving Women.
And yeah, so if anybody wants to Google it, it's Moving Windmills Project, and the URL is movingwindmillsproject.org.
.org. Perfect.
Yeah,
Good. Thank you. That's
yeah,
fascinating.
it is, and I'm very proud to be a part of that.
Yeah, of course. They do wonderful work, of course. That's outstanding. Um, so perhaps you could tell us more about, from the CPA point of view, about some of your international clients and what it's like working with them, the different nationalities.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that while initially when I started working with international clients, they were in the business of language translation for mostly for software companies,
Mm,
uh, because if any Microsoft or Intuit or anybody writes a piece of software and they want to sell it in other countries, the software itself needs to be translated into the local language. That's
mm,
why they
right,
call it language translation and localization, which Philip, I'm sure you're familiar with.
right.
But subsequent to the initial few clients I had that were in that business, it then expanded to clients in other countries in a variety of different businesses.
Mhm.
So, for example, I have a client in South Africa who runs a travel company and develops tours for people who want to come to South Africa and experience all the varieties of, uh, going to see the animals and
Right.
safaris
Safaris and so
and
forth.
all that kind of thing in South Africa. I have a film company out of Australia. I have tech companies out of Asia, Vietnam primarily, Singapore,
Mhm.
uh, and China. And I have a real estate guy in Italy who does real estate business here in the United States, but he's based in Italy. Um, I have another film company in Spain. And so the types of businesses that my international clients are in is much more varied than it was
Right.
initially. And I'm sorry, so what was the second part of your question?
So the cultural issues about dealing with these different clients and their expectations and
Yeah.
so forth.
Oh, yeah. So there are vast cultural differences, as you may imagine, between what I would call the laid back Australians versus the not so laid back Italians versus the versus almost like a I wouldn't say lazy, but extremely laid back Argentinians. That's not to say that these people aren't good business people. They are, and they're smart, and they know what they're doing, and so on and so forth. But just understanding, for example, I'll give you an example. So when I'm dealing with my Asian clients, mostly the ones in Vietnam and also in Singapore, they may email me and ask me, well, why didn't something already happen yesterday?
Mhm.
And oftentimes, and most of the time, if not all the time, it's not because of something we didn't do, but we're now waiting for a response from a government agency. Could be the IRS, could be something else. And so, but for them, it's like why this should have already happened. Whereas if I'm dealing with someone out of Australia or Argentina, they'll just wait until it happens. And that's just one example. I think that there are a lot more cultural differences than that, but those are a few that I can think of. I deal with some people in the UK, both in Scotland and in England, and particularly in England, London. Their culture is very similar to our own.
Right.
Particularly, me being in New York, London and New York, financial people. They're a very very similar kind of cultural mindset about the work that they do.
Right. Fascinating. Um, are there any other differences in, you mentioned the Italians are less laid back, which is sort of funny because they've got a reputation of being not certainly not lazy, but just relaxed, shall we say. And
Yeah, they do have that reputation, and it's a well-earned reputation. I mean, I've been to Italy 9 times, and so I can attest to that. But in my travels to Italy, I wasn't there on business.
right.
Okay? One of the things that I've dealt with a couple of different Italian business people, and they're pretty high-powered people. They have vast, business holdings, not only in Italy but throughout the world, and of course in the United States is how I have worked with them. And they're just as much on point about what needs to be done and how they view their business, that this is a business and it's not about sitting around and having a coffee, which
Right.
is okay to do too, but they're very, very, very organized about their business.
Straightforward.
Yeah.
One of the traits in Italy, as well as I think Germany and other countries, is that there are a lot of family-oriented family businesses, and they may be conglomerates, what we would call conglomerates.
Right.
But the number of businesses is relatively small because many key families own many key businesses, and there's less of an entrepreneurial culture than in the United States. It is growing and changing, but for the most part, traditionally, these family businesses have dominated the economies for generations.
Right. I would agree with that. I would
Yeah.
agree with that.
So one of your clients is one of these major Italian families, I assume?
Yes, they are. Yeah, they are. And they own a couple of pieces of real estate here in New York, and they referred to me by their real estate broker, who also happens to be a client of mine. So I now handle all their US tax work that surrounds that real estate here in New York.
Fascinating. Very good. Do you find that in other countries, in Singapore and Vietnam is a much newer international business culture.
Yeah.
So are they generally small and medium entrepreneurs, or is there a government stake in their business as well?
No, there's no government stake, as I understand it.
Mm.
But they are smaller entrepreneurs for sure, because as we all know, a country like Vietnam, which is communist,
Right.
just like China is communist. For the longest time, entrepreneurship was not something that was ever encouraged,
Right.
or even tolerated.
Right.
And that's changed. So we all hear about China, and how entrepreneurship is encouraged, and there are a lot of millionaires now and billionaires in China. Vietnam is newer to the game, so the entities and the businesses are definitely smaller than what you would find, say, in China, but it's growing, and the government there actively encourages people to into entrepreneurship, to do whatever it is that they do.
Mm.
So it's an interesting, change. I look, I remember the Vietnam era when we were fighting over there, and
Right.
who would have ever imagined
Right. Exactly.
then what's happening now in Vietnam, which has become a very successful modern country, even though it's still run by the communists. But I've seen I've never been, but I've seen photos of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, and all the skyscrapers, and you look at all of this and you say, wow, look at what
Yeah.
they've done. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. It's truly amazing. So your Vietnamese clients have businesses here in the US?
They do, yes. Yeah.
Are you able to say in what sector they're in?
Well, I can. I would say the majority of them are what I would call resellers. So they have developed an arrangement with companies like Amazon, where they source product elsewhere,
Right.
and then they sell it through Amazon. I have one guy that actually started a mortgage company in the United States, based in Vietnam, but a mortgage company in the US to provide mortgages here. I have a guy in Mexico that does the same kind of thing.
Wow.
They provide mortgages for US clients.
Huh.
So, for the variety of businesses that I see coming out of Vietnam isn't that great right now, but I imagine over time that's going to change as well.
And do you find, again, different cultural differences working with the Vietnamese versus the Mexicans and
Well,
Singapore?
I'll tell you how I work with the people in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Through a conduit in Singapore. So conduit in Singapore, they have a representative relationship with the Vietnamese clients.
Mhm.
Okay. So everything kind of flows from Vietnam through the Singapore agent, if you will, to me. And almost everybody in Singapore speaks English.
Right.
And so it's a much easier relationship for me and my people to have, speaking with them than it would be perhaps dealing directly with the Vietnamese clients.
Okay.
And with respect to the Mexican client that does has a mortgage company here in the United States, that's actually not that difficult at all. It's a very easy relationship.
Very fascinating.
Yeah.
In the translation business, and this was maybe 15 or 20 years ago, there were certain terms like home equity loan that did not exist in Spanish. And they had to be, we could translate the words, but then they had to be explained in parentheses what it meant. So
I'm curious, do those words exist now in Spanish?
I assume so. I think, yeah, it's much more familiar, but we haven't had to do those kinds of translations for quite a while now.
Okay.
But that was very interesting culturally.
Yeah. Well, I've often found, in other languages, every once in a while, when someone's speaking another way, it'd be Spanish, Portuguese, or whatever it may be, that all of a sudden you hear an English word in there because there's no word for it in their language. So they just take the English word and adopt it in.
Right. Yeah. Very true. And that's common also, especially in the IT business and the entertainment business.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's very true.
Yeah.
When you deal with the Singapore, let me back up. Your Vietnamese client, are they ethnic Chinese by chance?
No, they're Vietnamese.
They are. Okay. So,
and I have several, by the way, in Vietnam.
Hmm.
Not just one. I have probably 4 or 5.
And do they all deal with the Singaporean? They go through the Singaporean conduit?
That's how they find me, because the people in Singapore found me some years ago. So when they get a new client, they reach out to me and ask me, can you handle this and take it on? And so that's how that develops.
Oh, fascinating.
So it's almost like a feeder, a feeder agent for me for a business in Vietnam.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
And when you deal with the Singaporeans, most of them are Chinese, which is why I asked. And very often there's the ethnic connection, because especially in southern Vietnam, a lot of ethnic Chinese are there, and so they tend to work with their networks, their clan networks, as we would call it. The Lee family works with other Lees in Singapore,
right,
in the US, and so forth. When you deal with the Singaporeans, do you find that their business culture is more British or American, or do they have some uniquenesses that we don't?
Well, I would say it's more British, but I don't find the British business practices or cultures that significantly different from our own.
Right.
What's also nice about it, and I don't know if this is appropriate to say, but I have this woman that's worked for me for 12 years who's originally from China. Okay. And she speaks fluent Cantonese and Mandarin. Right. And so if there's ever a requirement for that kind of communication, she can handle it for me, which is fabulous.
Makes it very easy to really understand what they want to say.
Exactly. So sometimes there's a phone call, and oftentimes they will be able to speak most of it in English, but when they get kind of hung up a little bit, I bring her in. I say, can you do this for me? And just do the translation. And so she does.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, a plug for our own business, as you may know, we also offer what's called OPI, over the phone interpreting. So you do need to speak to someone, let's say in Vietnam directly, you don't speak Vietnamese, whatever. I assume your Vietnamese is not very fluent this year. It may have been better last year, but perhaps it's a bit rusty.
Vietnamese?
So if you do need to speak,
It's this much.
Very good. So if you do need to speak to someone in another language, we have a service called over the phone interpreting, where we give you a toll-free number and a PIN, and you tell the agent the language you want, and you're connected within seconds, and then you have a three-way conversation. You, the interpreter, your client, the interpreter, you. So
That's really great to know. I think I did know that, but I'm glad you reminded me. From a personal perspective, you know, I'm as you know, Philip, I plan to relocate to Spain in about a year, less than a year and a half, and I've been in conversations with a woman in Madrid who is interested in doing some work with me there. And it has nothing to do with my financial CPA practice at all. It's her business.
Right.
And you know, I don't know how many people know this, but you know, unlike in a lot of Western European countries where the native language is not English, most people, you know, where most people, at least in the larger cities, speak at least some English.
Right.
In Spain, and even in Madrid, which is the big city, it's not the case. There are younger people that do, but a lot of people don't speak English. And I've read that the reason for that is that you know, during the Franco era, the dictatorship, he outlawed that. He basically said no one can learn English. Right. And because it's a family hierarchical society where families live together a lot for a long time, if the grandparents don't speak it, the parents don't speak it, the parents don't speak it, the kids don't speak it, and so on and so forth. Younger people today, now they've introduced English in the schools there. I mean, it's been like that for a while. So more people are starting to speak English, but a lot of people in Spain don't.
Right. Well, our OPI service can be very useful to you.
Right. That's good. Good.
And you raised a very interesting point about the generations, where in the US, the nuclear families, you know, the mother, father, children, whatever, they live independently, and then when the children are, say, college age or early 20s, whatever, they would go off and, you know, live separately. Right. But in Spain, it's a more traditional society where you would have three generations in one household.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And probably, I don't know about Madrid, but certainly elsewhere, like a family compound with a house with a wall around it. Yeah. There may be, you know, obviously multiple rooms or perhaps separate buildings, but pretty much everyone lives in the compound.
And it's like that. It's Italy's like that too.
Italy's like that also.
But there are more Italians, I find, that speak English than Spaniards.
Yeah. Oh, and the other point, just because when people learn English, just like when, you know, people here learn Spanish in high school and sometimes college, you learn conversational level. But to speak on a business level is much more complicated. And most people don't do it, can't do it, don't know the vocabulary to do it. And that's where translators and interpreters are extremely necessary.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Totally agree.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
No, not necessarily. You know, the only thing I would say is that having gotten into this area of practice in my CPA practice, I can tell you that it's very fulfilling. It's very interesting. I love having clients all over the world. I mean, I touch every continent with the exception of Antarctica. So I can say that my business is truly global. and I'm proud of that. And I would encourage anybody who has an opportunity to work with people from other countries. And I think it not only is good business, but I think it opens your mind to other cultures and other ways of doing things, other business practices, and language. And I think it's exciting and wonderful to do. So I highly recommend it. I highly encourage it. And if anybody wants to talk to me about it, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and really appreciate all the wonderful work you're doing to facilitate global business internationally, and of course the wonderful work you're doing with Malawi as well.
Thank you, Philip. It's been my honor to be here. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's been my pleasure.
Thank you.